What bothers me is that there is an important wing in that movement, I think increasingly important, that is using schools for political and not educational ends. More importantly, no matter what anybody's intention is, the charter school movement has dumbed down the national discussion, right? It has us focusing on the things which we have no reason to believe matter very much. 3 fares, and I'm off here. I'm not even looking at Linda until I get through my 3. 1, I'm afraid that a small handful of really high-quality charters are now justifying the existence of a large number of mediocre or worse charters. 2, this is a deeply, deeply racialized discourse in ways that we are not talking about. If we were talking about any group of privileged children and an intervention of this mediocrity, that discussion would have been stopped years ago. It is only because we're talking about children of political capital that this conversation can go on. And lastly, all I want to say, that the fact that we have this discussion troubles me, right? And I give all you guys big kudos for being out here on a night when there's, but the fact that so many people of goodwill come together to spend 2 or 3 hours talking about what is, in fact, by all the data we have right now, a mediocre invention. We could be talking about extra learning time for children. We could be talking about supporting principals. We could be talking about improving instructions. We could be talking about making schools more supportive of parents. Instead, we talk about charters. There is something that is just completely insane about that. Right? So that's all I got to say.
Well, Andrea, I'm sure of a few things you want to respond to. Take it away.
Sure. So there's a lot in there to respond to, but I'll start off with a more general point. I find it curious that people don't credit the choices of parents in the city. It's the case that charter schools overwhelmingly serve poor neighborhoods, and poor parents are flocking to them in large numbers because they realize the better opportunity for their students and their children. I also think that pitting traditional public schools against charters is not useful at all, since the challenges faced by the teachers in those schools are quite similar. On some of the comments that were made, the Stanford report referenced by Dr. Payne, that's the Credo report that showed that 17% of charter schools nationally outperform peer-sampled schools. It studied 16 jurisdictions. In 5 of those jurisdictions, charter schools outperformed. One of those 5 was Chicago. So you can't talk about national data without looking at specific citywide or state data. The second point Jackson raised about what about graduation rates. It is true, as you saw on the earlier slide, the graduation rates in Chicago are quite competitive and high among charter schools. We've also got fairly robust data on college-going, college completion rates for charters. And on that measure, charter schools do quite well. I'm happy to share that data with Jackson or anybody else who wants it. It doesn't mean that all charters do well, but it is the case that there's something not captured in ACT results going on in charters that is developing the skills for students to go to and through college, which I think should be a focus of our work. I'd also note on the transparency point, we at INCS have supported, in fact, the law 2 years ago in Springfield that required charter performance to be broken out by campus, not by network level. So we now have much more visibility into charter performance. As a consequence of that, just this past year, CPS conditioned renewal of some charters on shorter probationary terms because of low performance. I'd also note that we at INCS have supported closing a low-performing charter when appropriate. I'd ask Jackson Potter when they've ever supported taking action against any school for any purpose, whether the school has been not performing for 10, 20, or 30 years. This movement is about accountability and making sure students have access to better options. It's not about protecting interests. It's not about our interests or school's interests. I'd also note on the teacher question, I find it curious as well that folks who are anti-charter and are pro-teacher don't realize that 3,000 teachers and charters struggle every day to teach students with real challenges. We should be supporting those teachers and principals, not demagoguing them on the issue. And finally, on one last point I want to make, I do find this discourse that's happened over the past couple of months defeating in a lot of ways. We as a city have real challenges. And to the extent we distract ourselves with this debate about whether traditional public schools or charter schools are better, we're missing the point. We don't have enough great schools of any type in the city. Charter schools are a part of that. They're not all of it, but we want to work towards a constructive solution and not demagogue the issue over and over so that we wind up having no solution at all.
Okay, I'd like to We could keep going on this for a while, but there are a few other issues I'd like to get to. And I go back to the question that I asked prematurely, which is, two rationales. One is that competition would improve all schools, and the other is that innovation would spread. Any signs of that happening? Someone?
I think the answer is unequivocally no, in terms of the overall average impact of these changes. Now, there are some outliers, and we should talk about those in great detail. So if you listen to former CEO Terry Mazzani, he said, I ran the numbers when I was at CPS, when he was superintendent. And charters, based on being freed from restrictions of bureaucracy, should be knocking the socks off neighborhood schools, but they're not. It's a dead heat. And so why is it that charters that have all these advantages, most of them, vast majority, district-wide attendance boundaries, it's a lottery system. It mimics and reflects what magnet schools do. You have to apply to get in. You do a lottery, so people have to be really motivated to apply to it. How come we're not making that comparison? When we look among schools, even when you don't show them as having these advantages, schools whose students are at least 90% free or reduced lunch and 90% African American, charters average at the 33rd percentile in reading score gains. Their neighborhood school counterparts at the 43rd percentile. What's the response to that, Andrew? In terms of closing schools, we don't even want charter schools to close. That's disruptive. That's happened for far too long. Over 88% of the students impacted by school closings, consolidations, and turnarounds have been African American families. If they're knocking down the doors of charter schools, it's because their school's been closed. And you can ask anybody in this room who's been around for a while, whether it's G2 Brown, whether it's Jay, Travis, they'll tell you that schools that were high performing in the Kenwood-Oakland community region were disrupted and sabotaged by policies that CPS imposed. We cannot go from a system that has goals of egalitarianism. Everybody should have a good school, not boutique schools that specialize in this, that, or the other thing. But when you don't invest in schools, when you don't have air conditioning, when you don't have art teachers, social workers, libraries, librarians, and you have this patchwork quilt where some kids get that stuff and others don't, that's a real problem. Then you're comparing apples and oranges every time you're trying to analyze and assess what's happening in our system. That has to change.
Andrew, you want to jump in?
We are
briefly?
glad to have a discussion about school funding. The expenditure data that ISB reports on this is quite clear. Charter schools spend substantially less per pupil than regular public schools do. That is mainly a consequence of the fact that charter school teachers are underpaid relative to their traditional public school counterparts. In fact, the data on this is clear from 2 years ago. The average teacher in CPS, excluding charters, earns $74,000. The average charter school teacher earns $54,000. We think that's wrong, and that should be addressed by funding charters equally. Charter schools, to some degree, make up that difference by private fundraising, but it's 10% of the gap. And so that's why we at INCS are working on equal funding provisions both with the district and in state law to make sure charter school students are not treated like second-class citizens in their own city.
Can I address that really quickly?
Briefly.
Sorry. Yeah. How many schools do you think should be closed this year, Andrew? I want to hear you say exactly how many you want closed, because you never do. You say, give them 2 more years. How many schools have been closed that are charters since this experiment began? And before you answer that, this year it cost $11,361 on average for each of the 4,665 additional charter school slots. They get approximately $500,000 in startup funds. You're reproducing administrative and facilities expenses. The state funds extra for some of that. They double dip. They get state funding for facilities, and they get city funding. We need to really differentiate how much are they getting. And when we look at CEO pay, people who are the top of the charter networks, they're getting way more than Barbara Bird Bennett compared to the per pupil ratio if you compare it to what the CEO is making. So you have Juan Rangel, who's making nearly as much as Barbara Bird Bennett, but he's running 10 schools. You have similar things happening for CICS and Learn and Urban Prep and the major networks, where the CEOs at the top are getting, 6-figure salaries, and everybody else pays the cost, like the teachers.
A question for Jackson. Charter schools are doing many of the things that the teachers union advocates: smaller class size, more counselors, more attention to social and emotional learning, and so on. Isn't that a good thing?
Do that for the schools that exist. You know, they're talking about underutilization. You know, they're talking about closing 125 schools and opening 60 new charters. So they're exacerbating the crisis of underutilization. They're siphoning kids away. Charters are using money from corporations to try and attract students and take them out of neighborhood schools, which creates the underutilization crisis in the first place. So what I would argue is if we stop all this madness, let's look at what we currently have and invest in those schools to make sure they have everything that children need and deserve. That's the model where we can carefully analyze and assess if that's working. What are the charter school innovations that other schools should have? I've not heard that yet from Andrew. What are the things that should be translated? And how can we do that instead of constantly trying to decimate the other schools?
What about innovation?
Sure, happy to address that. So one example, we've had this pitch debate the past year over a longer school day, right? CPS finally moved to it after fighting for decades over 15-minute more instructions for students. Charters have done that for 11 years. I'd like to think that the charter model using that has created conditions under which we can now do it in the city. We have all sorts of thematic charter schools in the city. We have a Montessori charter school opening up next year, a math and science charter school, performing arts charter school. These sorts of things are partnering with, yes, traditional neighborhood schools to talk about how we can collaboratively work teacher to teacher. The problem with Jackson's position is he's reflexively anti-charter. If it's charter, it's bad, and that's just not true. The data doesn't bear it out. The schools don't bear it out. And I'd invite him to come visit some charter schools with me to see firsthand what the teachers are doing there, because there are some examples of real innovation happening in the classroom.
What are they?
That can be translated.
Longer day. We all have longer day now. No more need for charters. Good. We solved the problem.
Jackson.
I mean,
After fighting it for 15 years, right.
okay, so now we can say it's a truce.
So second
Let's
point.
shake on it.
Second point. With respect to evaluating teachers, one of the big debates during the union fight over the past few months is the degree to which teacher evaluation should be based on student individual growth at the school level. The union generally fought that percentage down. They settled down to what state law requires under a law passed 2 years ago. The charter movement has been doing that now for 8 years and trying to tie teacher evaluation to a teacher's individual impact on students in a way that is leading the discussion. On union rights themselves, we've got 14 unionized charters. Their union contracts vary between 12 pages and 14 and 18 pages. They're flexible contracts preserving a longer school day, and those are models for what our union should be doing more broadly to make the document responsive to student needs. There's even a provision in one of the union contracts saying, in the event of a disagreement between management and teachers, the mediator shall put into place what's best for students. That would never make itself into a CTU contract.
It is in our contract.
That's innovation.
It's in our
moving
contract.
forward.
Read the tentative agreement online. It's in our contract. We have a preamble that talks about best practices on behalf of students and their families.
A preamble's not a mediator statement.
Okay, well,
Okay.
I'm going to let Charles take over because I don't want to monopolize the time. So.
No,
Speak into the microphone, Charles.
there's so much. Just one thing about
Yeah.
this notion of, I think there are places, although I cannot name them from memory, where there has been some productive discourse between charters and traditionals. I'm sure I could identify places if you gave me half an hour. I don't think it has happened very often. And I think that in the end, Jackson does have a point. The thing, so far as you can see, the things that it takes to develop a good charter and the things that it takes to develop a good traditional school are about the same things. So the idea from 15 or 20 years ago that there are going to be laboratories of innovation, this is not a problem that needs innovation. This is a problem, so far as I can see, this is about blocking and tackling. You need to pay attention to the basics. I see a few consortium faces around me, right? And so we can launch into a discussion of developing schools as organizations. I do think under certain circumstances, the flexibility of charters can give you some advantages. I think it's fairly small and not large enough, again, to justify the amount of time, energy, and leadership attention that they are getting. And taking our time away from other things that I think have a higher likelihood of deep payoff. I want to emphasize that.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Our charter is expected to provide students with art, music, PE, foreign language, and a library. Or are those only optional for charters?
So that depends on the school. I think it's fair to say that most charters in the city have some sort of library, depending on funding they receive. They don't have extensive libraries typically. They also have flexibility over the curricular choices. Most charter schools have fairly robust special courses, including things like art and music and those sorts of courses. But it's up to the charter to design it. The whole point of a charter is that it's not a simple single model, but rather the design team, the teachers that design the school, will design what the neighborhood needs, what the students want, and provide that. It's worth noting that some of our best charters in Chicago, including Noble, Polaris, Namaste, were all founded by former CPS teachers because they thought the charter model gave them an opportunity to be creative and design a curriculum around what students need and not be constrained by CPS rules that change from time to time or don't adjust flexibly enough to deal with the students they have today. So there's no blanket answer to the question, but I think it is accurate to say that the charter model provides the framework by which the students and the educators can design the model for their needs.
I think this is actually the nub of a real problem in how we're thinking about school reform. So choice has actually become code for separate but unequal. You know, where certain operators provide certain things and others don't have to, and it's all kind of, you know, wheeling, dealing, this patchwork quilt that's uneven. And the whole notion of a right to an education is that everybody deserves an incredibly tremendous education. You know, you look at Finland, and what they do there is they provide after-school tutoring, small class sizes. You know, they invest heavily in teacher professional development. They give teachers autonomy to make their own lesson plans. But all the schools have the same stuff. They invest in all the schools the same way. And we have the problem of 30 million kids live in poverty in this country. Why isn't the charter movement asking about increasing affordable housing? Why isn't the charter movement saying, let's raise the minimum wage for working families? Those things would actually produce a tremendous increase in academic achievement. But it's all about let's get rid of unions. And we need to really look at these things. Like when we talk about hospitals, do we talk about everybody should have one hospital that's good at, you know, open heart surgery and that hospital is good at dealing with the flu? No, you want all of those things in a good hospital. You want everything to be able to treat you. And so when we keep talking about decentralizing our schools and letting charter operators decide, that's undemocratic. You know, where is the parent voice? Where is the societal commitment to egalitarianism, to make sure everybody has a chance to make it in this society?
I have two questions about choice and parent choice, actually. Why is there such a hostile attitude toward parents having a choice to select an alternative education? And then what is the parent-community process and community engagement process look like in charter schools and actually getting them open and keeping them accountable? So a couple of questions around.
Let me respond to the first, this notion about hostility toward choice. First of all, and I would to some degree criticize Jackson for speaking of the charter school movement as if it's just one holistic thing. We have to make distinctions. The important point for me is we don't have enough good schools in this city that we can give up any of them. Some of the ones that are good are charters. They should be protected, they should be nurtured, and I'm perfectly okay with reasonable and judicious expansion of those schools, right? So, so I don't want to make this a discussion about charters as a single entity. The issue of choice is complicated. So far as I know what's happening among parents in Chicago, a great many parents are desperate for any alternative. If the alternative in front of them is charters, they will go for charters. If you give them another, then they will go for that. That's one element, and I respect that, and to the degree that that's a market, we ought to try to meet it. One, two, I also know that demand is being manipulated, right? It's being manipulated by people who are telling parents, well, if you're in a traditional public school, you might want to think about that because that school might not be here in 2 years. That might be closed. By people who are putting desirable programs into charter facilities and on and on. So the idea that parent choice should be respected, that's right. But we should also understand that there is some element of construction, of manipulation going on in the issue of choice, right? And the cities, by the way, that I think have made choice work be something other than a way to increase class and race segregation, which is what I think it is in Chicago and Philly. The cities where choice works are cities that created good schools first, and then they gave people a choice. They didn't assume that giving people a choice would drive the development of good schools. That, there ain't much evidence for.
But you know, when you look at like a Whitney Young, where I went to high school, I mean, if every school was Whitney Young, would we be having this conversation? You know, would we be talking about choice, or would we be just talking about good quality schools in every neighborhood? And so I think it's often used as a foil to distort and distract from what are the real issues here. How do we get to that point where every school has those kinds of resources and capabilities? And Charles, you know, mentioned it, that many schools, we have a tremendous rate of inequality, 23% child poverty rate in this country. You know, life expectancy is lower than any other developed nation in the world, and the wealth disparities are tremendous. And unless we address those things, it's going to be hard to get to a point where all schools are equal. And so some schools are going to need startup funds to get to a point to close that education deficit that's been created over generations. I did want to say and accept the criticism Charles gave of me, that, you know, there are some charters out there that have some things going for them that we should learn from. I think Namaste has some good school culture things and attentive to a lot of environmental issues and health issues that schools could learn from. You know, school culture in Noble Street, it's very, you know, strict and disciplined. But we also have to look at what's beneath that, right? So I have a letter from Noble Street Rauner that was sent to a student, and it says, you're required to repeat the entire 11th grade because you failed 2 classes out of your 7, unless you transfer to the neighborhood school. Then we'll give you all your credits. So what's happening is this distortion in a magnitude that we are really not aware of yet. You know, the $400,000 in fines that parents paid in Noble Street last year is a disgrace. That's something that prevents people from being able to attend school and finish because they're being pushed out.
Can charter schools address inequities and opportunity to learn associated with race, ethnicity, and class? What may be behind this is that with charter schools, obviously, is your choice. You have to apply. And so you can apply outside of a particularly disadvantaged neighborhood. You can, you know, go someplace else.
Sure, I suppose that's true. I mean, just from the ground, the fact of the matter is most charter schools in the city are on the west and south sides. That's why, in fact, most charter schools serve a predominantly African-American population. It's a matter of kind of geographic concentration. One thing it also suggests is that, you know, charter schools are making choices to go where demand is and where they think they can make the most impact. One of the big constraints on that, though, is access to buildings. Charter schools are not getting any public facilities dollars from the state. There is an allocation for a certain category of charters in the district, but only in non-district owned buildings. I think, frankly, it doesn't make any sense to require charter schools to use scarce public dollars meant for instruction, and they have to then use those dollars on private buildings to find access so their students can go to school. We should have a system in place where public schools get access to public buildings and public dollars so they can wind up serving things efficiently. In an era where we're talking about school closings, that should definitely be on the table.
Charles, do you want to weigh in on this? You don't? Okay.
No, I'll let it go.
This is to Jackson. As a former high school teacher in Englewood, and presumably having had witnessed closely the plight of hundreds of young black boys, how do you reconcile your staunch opposition to charters with urban prep's success as evidenced by its far better graduation rate? And let's not argue over what those numbers are. Sure. They are clearly better. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm glad to weigh in on that particular question. You know, and like I said, I think there's amazing charter school teachers out there, and there's some networks doing good things, and I think we should call a truce. I think we should stop the expansion, really get a handle and analyze and assess what's happened over the last 8 years. Has it worked? What hasn't? And let those charter school teachers unionize. Let them have rights on the job. And let parents have LSCs in charters so they have some say. Formally, not an imaginary way, but in a real way. In terms of Englewood, you know, it's interesting. The person who was my mentor, he went to Englewood High School in the 50s, in the late 50s. When it had become primarily African American. And they had 3,000 students, one police officer who sat at the front desk, and open campus lunch, so students could come and leave as they pleased. By the time I was there, there were 600 students, 16 full security guards, 2 full-time police officers, and Title I anti-poverty funds being used for a camera to circumnavigate the block. When they closed my school, so was that because bad teachers suddenly taught at Englewood? Or is there something else going on in society? And so what happened when they closed Englewood is it replaced with urban prep. 70% of the students who attended urban prep weren't in the attendance boundaries of Englewood community. They were outside of it. And then Tim King, had a very good foundation wing from Hales Franciscan where he came over from, and he raised $300,000 a night on some, poker nights with his donors. That helped. They could send kids. They pushed out a lot of kids. So if you look at the freshman class and the graduating class, huge difference. And then they're still getting 16s on the ACT, which is below the district average. So it's the philanthropy that's allowing these students to, and that's great. Philanthropists should do that for all CPS students. But because they can't pick and choose the winners and losers. This is not Survivor, people. This is public education.
Yeah, I think that was a fairly partial description of what's going on, so far as I know, right? It is possible that the philanthropy is a part of what makes the difference, but that's only a possibility. We don't know that, right? My only, I don't know how many times I've done professional development for urban prep, how many of my students teach there. There is, and I'll say frankly, there are some issues about instruction on which that school, like most schools, still have a way to go. In terms of the quality of adult-student relationships, it's at one end of the spectrum for me. It's at the stronger end, right? That is, of all the schools I've seen in my career, it's the sense of avuncularity, is that a word? The sense that your teacher is your uncle, and the expectation that you spend time with your teacher outside of school like you would with your uncle. That's very deep. And the folk in the audience who know this data is better than I do, but I think the way the data are moving suggests that students who have this sense of strong social bonding are as likely to do well within certain kind of limits. The next level up as students who have strong academics, right? The social supports can carry students from our toughest neighborhoods a long way. I don't want that denigrated. Okay.
And notice I didn't say close urban prep, despite my own personal, traumas that are associated with that time in my life. But if that's the case, and I don't disagree, we should learn from that. How can we transplant that? Instead of like, we're going to innovate to teach everybody how to do things, and then you never teach anybody the innovations. Let's figure out what's working and use it.
I think it's an important point to underscore on this, too. There are a number of charter high schools in the city that have done a tremendous job of sending students to competitive colleges and then seeing them through college, even though their ACT scores would otherwise predict not fully college preparedness. So, for instance, we've got North Lawndale, Young Women's, Urban Preps in this category, where they've got EPAS gain scores about 4 or 5, getting to a 17.5, and we think 21's college ready, and yet those 17.5 scores are going off to competitive four-year colleges and succeeding. There's something happening within those schools in terms of the quality of relationships that's developing in those young people, the ability to actually persist and succeed, and that's something we should talk about much more broadly. Because frankly, quibbling over the test scores without looking at the goal of preparing for life and success in college and beyond sometimes distracts us from the real goal.
And that's happening at neighborhood schools too. Like, that's not a phenomenon that's specific or unique to charters. Social justice, where I was teaching, we have 5 Posse Scholars the last 2 years, which is a record. It's a small school of 300 students, so that's happening.
Creating more charters, is there a limit to the talent pool and resources? That is, charter board members and entrepreneurial staff, philanthropy that fuels the better charters?
I think the main constraint right now is funding, to be very frank with the audience. And this is not unique to charters. The district is under enormous financial pressures, as you probably know. But our funding has been cut over the past 4 years to charter schools by the district. There was a small 3.4% bump this year in funding, which we advocated for. But overall, since 2009, the funding has actually gone down slightly, while the district spending has gone up, with the exception of this year when it's gone down a bit. And so that discrepancy of teacher salaries I mentioned before is really inhibiting what makes charters work. To the extent they work, it's because they have great leaders and committed teachers, and we're seeing a lot more out-migration of teachers in years 4, 5, and 6 because the discrepancy in pay widens as the teachers get more senior. That's a real problem for the sector, so that's much more of a constraint, I think, than is board membership or support of other sorts.
Yeah. since you have to have a parent that is savvy enough to know to apply and so on, it can be argued that, you're leaving regular schools with an increasing concentration of students who may not have that kind of support. And what do you do about that?
Yeah, this is really the selection bias question that really undergirds some of the research on charter schools. So there's a theory out there that because a parent must apply to a charter, the cohort of students that wind up enrolling in charters are therefore more motivated, therefore not fully representative of the regular public school system. So Carolyn Hawksby from Harvard has done some good research on this that actually controls for this by looking at students who get into the lottery randomly and those who did not get in. So in other words, they've controlled for the selection effect on the front end and then traced those students over time to see how well they do in a charter school or in a non-charter alternative they wound up going to. And the data is not overwhelming, but it's pretty strong evidence that the students that wound up in the charter school and were similarly motivated wound up doing better over longitudinal years than did the students who were randomly selected not in. So I do think there's that reality on the ground. But one of the solutions to the challenge is we've got to empower parents even more and try to find ways to reach them and provide them with great school options however they're structured. Charter schools are not counter to having great traditional public schools. In fact, I think in the best districts in the country, they work together. In Denver, for instance, charter schools and regular public schools work hand in hand very well. Because of the political situation in this city, we've now got a situation where charters are pitted against traditional publics, and that's not benefiting anybody long term.
I mean, part of the reason that we're being pitted against each other is you describe a bump in charter funding this year. Well, there's a decline in funding for neighborhood schools. So there's a commensurate relationship to those two things. And we have to pay attention. You know, they're talking about expanding 60 charters. That's a real concern for us. And when we look at access, EPASS scores, when you look at Explore, those are freshmen coming in. So they test in September. And for charters, when we looked at the Explore data, we see that they're second in the city to magnet schools in terms of the highest scoring on Explore. So that's already stacking the deck. And so we're already comparing apples and oranges at that point.
Well, let's just look at the gain scores then. I mean, control for the incoming score, and you'll see that charters are overrepresented among those who gain at the high school level in the city.
Right, but are they gaining because students come in already well prepared?
No, and the gain is a difference between 9th and 11th grade, Explore, Plan, so it controls for that, Jackson.
Well, I'm happy for our researchers to, sit down and figure out if we're looking at different things.
Well, to speak for one researcher here, it's just interesting how quickly we go back to what I think is the wrong question, right? Charters in Chicago compared to traditionals in Chicago. Those are two failing systems. The great majority of children in either system are not likely to do well in this world as we ordinarily understand that. They are failing systems. And if you want to be better on this measure and you want to be better on that measure, you both have my blessing. That's not the question. The question we should be asking are where in this country do we find the best options for children like our children, right? That's the question. And then if charters become a part of that discussion, that's fine. But you can't start the discussion with charters and get any place, right? I won't say that again for 5 minutes.
At the end of the day, can't we ultimately link student performance to early education and parental involvement? How do either charters or neighborhood schools adequately address this issue, something outside their scope? Well, in general, you get the question. Right? Early childhood education and parent involvement.
How do we do that better?
Yeah, how do charters or regular schools get at that issue, which is really important?
I mean, I think we need massive investment in early childhood. It's tremendously important. We need more wraparound services. Children who come to school hungry or don't have dental care, that's going to affect their attendance. We see in the recent report in the Tribune on Sunday the very high levels of truancy. We need a whole new subsection of people who can do outreach and make sure that children have what they need and deserve in terms of social services. And early childhood programming is essential to that. It sets students on pace to succeed. It gives them the basic things they need to do well in school. There needs to be a Marshall Plan for our city schools. And so, you know, to Charles's point, we need a massive investment in the schools if we're really going to address the problems that we face.
Do many charter schools have preschools?
A few do, not that many. I actually support the notion of earlier and greater investment in early learning for the city broadly. I think that's important. I think the mayor's done that, in fact, in his first budget. I'd also like to make a point, though. Sometimes people talk about parents as either involved or uninvolved, good or bad, without thinking about how we can engage them more meaningfully. A school that does nothing to invite parents in or creates barriers to access will not maximize parent engagement. I think charters do a pretty good job reaching out to communities to try to engage parents in meaningful ways through things like listening sessions, outreach after school, wraparound programs after school. Charters have longer school days on average. They can do some of these things flexibly. And so we should be doing more of that broadly in the city, not less.
I want to respond to two pieces of that. I think, again, we're all agreed on the importance of early childhood, but I think one of the things that is so disappointing about this discussion in Chicago as compared to other cities is we don't have systematic citywide discussion about how we leverage something that we know has long-term effects on the lives of children. That's one thing. But the I've forgotten my other point, so I'll let that go.
We'll come back.
Sorry.
What else should be done to increase accountability for charter schools? I know the financial question is a big one. We tried to get budgets a couple years ago and couldn't. Charles thought of his question, right?
That's right, exactly right. I just wanted to say, and it actually is pertinent to the issue of accountability in a way. I have it on good authority, even though I haven't seen the study, that studies from the East Coast say that if you ask the parents who go to charter schools what they like about, who have children in charter schools, what they like about them, there is a significant number of them who say, we find the charter schools more responsive to us as parents, right? And for everyone in this room who is a traditional public school advocate, I want you to think about that, right? I hear so many parents in this city say they're not comfortable in their schools, they feel put down by school staff. I'm talking about traditional public schools now, right? And so everybody who's talking about, yeah, traditional public schools, we need to rethink the degree to which those schools are setting an appropriate, welcoming, supportive climate for parents, right? I think that is a very